World Affairs Roundup, next on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to International Focus and another edition of our World Affairs Roundup. I'm Robert Ricigliano, Director of the Institute of World Affairs at UWM. Today we'll be looking at Israel and the other Barak. Defense Minister Ehud Barak jolted Israel's political landscape with a threat to bring down the coalition government of Prime Minister Ehud Olmert if Olmert doesn't step aside in the wake of corruption charges. Will domestic turmoil in Israel bring another halt to the peace process? Reluctant recipients. Nearly a month after a devastating cyclone hit Myanmar, the country's military rulers said they will allow waiting UN relief workers into the country. Will their belated response to the crisis impact their grip on power? When Hu met Wu. Cross-strait relations thawed this week as Chinese President Hu Jintao met in Beijing with Wu Po-xiang, chairman of Taiwan's ruling Kuomintang Party. Wu's visit marks the highest level contact since China and Taiwan split in 1949. Is Beijing on the road to finally implementing its one China policy? Solidaridad in the South. South America's 12 nations have formally established a continental body similar to the EU. Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez called the Union of South American Nations, or UNASUR, a counterweight to the United States. What are the implications for U.S.-Latin American relations going forward? To help us explore these issues, we're joined today by John Katzka, a retired U.S. Foreign Service officer who conducted public diplomacy for the Department of State on 4 continents. Representative Frederick Kessler, who represents the 12th District in the Wisconsin State Assembly. He also works as a political consultant in the U.S. and abroad and has served as a circuit court judge. And Robert Kraig, author of a number of articles and books dealing with the history and politics of American foreign policy. He currently serves as the Director of Program for Citizen Action of Wisconsin. Well, welcome to World Affairs Roundup. Robert, I want to start with you on, Fred, I want to start with you on Israel and the other Barak.
Okay.
This is a story, as you read into this, reads almost like a soap opera. I mean, there's so much political intrigue going on within Olmert's own party. He's survived several threats to his leadership within his ruling coalition, between his ruling coalition and the opposition. And I'm wondering, as someone who works in state government here, can you shed a little light on the political intrigue that's going on here?
Well, I think the structure of the Israeli parliament contributes to some degree of the intrigue and to a degree of the instability and the necessity for forming coalitions. Theirs is the ultimate proportional representation political body. There's 120 members in the Knesset, and I think you have to get 1% or 2%, and if you get 2%, you get seats in the Knesset. And the effect of that is there's probably about 25 to 30 parties that are represented. No party has more than 20 or 25 members, and even some of those shift constantly. And so what you end up having is a continued process of deal-making internally in order to form a government. And the minute one party is dissatisfied with one policy, they may threaten to pull out and the government collapses, so they then have to try to renegotiate what they're doing. And I think we're at the situation where the Labor Party, which is one of the larger parties, but not the largest, is now trying to assert its muscle because I think they're deeply offended with Olmert, but they're in a position where they can't really force an election because Ehud Barak is not a member of parliament. And so if Olmert collapses, Barak can't take his place. There has to be a new election before he can.
So Robert, is your take on this? This is true outrage at the corruption charges, or is this sort of backroom palace maneuvering to seize control of the government?
I think it's both. I think this kind of corruption charge is unusual in Israel and is a blow to their psyche. They consider themselves a lot cleaner government than, say, the U.S. government or some of the European governments, for example. But there's also obviously a lot of posturing. There's even a theory out there that this has been moved by Likud in order to try to head off the peace process, that suddenly a businessman from New York, yes, comes in to, flies in from New York and gives this dynamic testimony just when the peace process might be getting going. I think it's arguable whether the peace process was in motion or not, but there's something going on. But so there's clearly both capitalizing on it politically, and also some real outrage and some real sense that Olmert is fatally compromised here and can't possibly move a peace process under these conditions, regardless of whether some people are trying to capitalize on it. Right,
John. And looking at this in the broader regional context, the negotiations both with the Palestinians, both Abbas and Hamas, but also with Syria, talks being sort of brokered by Turkey. What's the impact on those discussions?
Sure. Well, what we end up with is a number of very wounded characters that are involved in these negotiations. Abbas is hardly speaking for the Palestinians. He's fighting a rearguard action against Hamas. Olmert is in trouble, may not be able to continue forward with this. We have Iran, where Ahmadinejad is also in trouble with his religious superiors. And we have a president who was looking to get something accomplished in the region before he left office. And so he's lame duck, and this looks very complicated going forward.
Well, is this, as Robert suggests, possibly, you mentioned the sort of conspiracy theory that it may be Netanyahu and the Likud party who's trying to engineer Olmert's fall.
Right.
Is that a plausible theory?
Well, it is I would say it's a factor. I mean, if he hadn't committed any of these things, there wouldn't have been an issue. There was also an interesting sidelight to this in that Barak was told to proceed carefully because another political advisor suggested that he also had to worry about envelopes that were passed. And I trust that there's no American, certainly a Wisconsin legislator, who has ever received envelopes like that.
I hope so too.
We're not looking at you for any reason, Fred. Just generally talking about.
But there is one point that comes through all this. When you start to look at who is in a stronger position within the region, the Saudis come up looking much stronger as a result. First of all, they have pretty much put their house in order at home. The oil revenues give them a great deal of flexibility in terms of affecting action throughout the region. So,
I think there's one other thing, though, that I think is we ought to take note of, and that is I do believe that there is a reasonable chance that there may be a Syria-Israel accord on the Golan Heights. From what I am understanding, there is some serious negotiating going on that Turkey is trying to act as the good faith broker.
I suppose there are those that would say that if Syria is thinking this is an opportunity for a peace deal, they'd want to seal it now. If Olmert his time is limited, I mean that may also actually push things along.
But there is Hezbollah's role in this, and they have no interest in this agreement, and the U.S. has suggested we have no interest in this deal. So there's a lot of opposition before that can go forward.
Great. Well, I'm going to move us across to a totally different region, talking about Myanmar. And Robert, I want to start with you on this. It's curious that regimes, especially regimes with tight grips on power, like the generals in Myanmar, have often often led to their collapse has been ethnic cleansing or some act of commission. This is an act of omission, of saying you cannot come in, you cannot. But is that sort of attempt to keep the door so tightly shut possibly going to lead to their ultimate downfall?
It ought to, but it's hard to say. We know very little about the internal political situation there, other than to know that they've held their main opponent under house arrest for 6 years and 18 of the last 25 years, as I understand. If they had any shred of legitimacy left, it's gone now that they've allowed tens of thousands of people to die just because they were afraid of the spectacle of having other countries helping them after a hurricane. It's just absolutely outrageous. It's a horrendous sin of omission. It's not an international law issue so much, but an international ethics issue that there needs to be some way to deal with this regime. But as to whether there's any internal situation that could cause that, I mean, this is a very poor country. I mean, and part of it is hurricane ravaged right now. So it's hard to say what this does in terms of their grip on power, but it certainly look, I mean, in a way, their paranoia has been a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the rest of the International Committee is openly talking about how do we use this situation to try to improve, to move them out. And you have dissidents saying that just sending of aid is actually playing the game of the leadership of the junta. So the junta may actually be benefiting from this in a perverse and horrendous sort of way.
John, in terms of the precedent for this and sort of international practice around disasters like what happened with the cyclone, I mean, how many options does the international community have? I mean, can they force a government to let aid workers in on their outsiders' terms?
No. Clearly, we still work from the idea that the nation state defines the parameters under which others can come in, up to the point that we decide through other mechanisms, either the UN or NATO or somewhere else, like as we did in Bosnia and in Kosovo, or as we did in Iraq, that we're going to move on this. But there are three reasons I would suggest why, even with as we tape this, they have now forcefully evacuating some of the government-run centers, pushing the people back to their residences. But there's three reasons why I don't think this is going to affect them. First of all, they had moved the capital about 300 miles north of what is Rangoon now, and so it was not affected. So the government apparatus was not hit by this cyclone. The second thing is, in the West, the US, the Europeans, generally are not interested in this issue. There's no significant national interest.
The issue of Burma, Myanmar.
Burma in itself. And then the third reason is that India, Thailand, and China have very strong reasons not to see a total destabilization of Myanmar, because that would cause the influx of refugees, much like they were concerned about North Korea.
Fred, we were talking earlier, you had sort of raised the possibility that they have two fears here. One is if they open the door too much and they let in foreigners, it's going to lead to this unraveling. Can you say more about the fear of what would happen if they didn't try to keep the door closed but actually opened it up?
Yes, I think people, certainly leaders all around the world, realize what happened to Gorbachev when he opened up the Soviet Union. And once you start the process of reform, then I believe the next thing that ends up happening is people demand more and more reform. We saw that in the Soviet Union with Gorbachev. We saw that in South Africa when the National Party decided they were going to end up finally reaching an accommodation with Mandela and the ANC. And what they assumed that they could control the process immediately spun out of control. And I suspect that the leadership there fears that if they start doing some of these things, their control could spin out and they could be displaced by others.
Well, displaced might be the mildest form of reaction.
We just have a few seconds left, Robert. I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit on John's notion that are the aid workers, by complying totally with the general's restrictions, actually abetting the regime?
Some dissidents would certainly feel that way and feel the whole International Committee is abetting, but obviously the aid agencies want to do whatever they can, because people were 25 days and up to a month out, and so it's a desperate situation. Probably it is, but probably it's an ethical necessity to try to save everyone you can at this point.
Sure. It's like the French moving the supplies off their military ships and sending them into Thailand to be transshipped. What was the higher good that was involved?
Great. Well, we'll be back in just a moment here in National Focus after a short break, and we'll be talking about China and Taiwan. We'll see you in just a moment on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus and our World Affairs Roundup. We're talking with John Katzka, Frederick Kessler, and Robert Kraig. And John, I want to start with you to help us put some perspective on the meeting between the Kuomintang chairman Wu and Hu Jintao in China. Is this a momentous event in China-Taiwan relations, or is it more of a strategic, short-lived photo op?
Before we start that, I hope that your listeners, our viewers, remember Abbott and Costello, because this intro sounds very much out of that. Isn't it something that the Kuomintang are now talking more conciliatorily to the mainland? What a change in events. To answer your question directly, though, I don't think this is a strategic move. This is a tactical move. This is part of China being somewhat conciliatory because of the bashing that they took over Tibet, thank you, Tibet, and the torch relay, and looking toward the Summer Olympics and trying to keep the ledger clear. Also, the fact that China has had enormous economic success in the last number of years also improves the view that from Taiwan as to what the role the mainland can play for them.
I mean, is this just basically a proof that the economic relationship between China and Taiwan has overtaken the political rivalry, Fred? I mean, how do you see that?
That would be my guess. I think certainly when you add in the presence of Hong Kong and the fact that that's had a great deal of prosperity and that's visible to the mainland, then you now see this loosening. I think a lot of that is they've kept solid control of the politics. They're not going to take any prisoners, or they're not going to give up any prisoners. They're going to keep control of the politics. But the economy, they've really gone almost to the full free market.
And Robert, this is, as John was mentioning, a pretty eventful time for China with the earthquake, with the Olympics coming up, with the Tibet situation, and now with this potential thawing of a relationship. Is it a time when China wants to add that into their plate?
I mean, it's such an open sore for them. They want to do something, and they want to have progress of some kind at this point. And I think there's a sense the economic situation has overtaken the political situation, which is archaic. We have two governments, the ROC and the People's Republic of China, that both claim to be the only legitimate ruler of all of China. And you have the One China agreement from 1992, but a disagreement as to what that means, an agreement to disagree on what that means.
My One China or your One China.
Yes, exactly. And in the trip itself, the party leader from the KMT actually went through to the Sun Yat-sen, to his shrine and birthplace on the way over. So kind of recognizing the whole history of the ROC versus the People's Republic of China. So it is a kabuki dance, to use a Japanese metaphor, so it's a mixed metaphor in a certain sort of way. But at the same time, even if you read closely the comments on each side, and of course doing it in translation, as John would say, is always difficult, right, and treacherous, they just suggest it's the beginning of a conversation in a different relationship. So there's some hope that it leads to something, but it's certainly not. And it's historic in the sense that it's the first meeting of this kind since 1949, but there isn't much substance to that first meeting. It's entirely ceremonial.
It's not bad. It's just not bad. I mean, it may not be wonderful, it may not be historic, but it's not a bad thing to be happening.
I mean, a lot of people suggested that the status quo of both sides insisting they're the one China, but having a healthy economic relationship and low military tensions just serves everybody's interest. And John, I wanted to ask you to comment on that and where the U.S. is in all this in terms of what the U.S. wants to see happen.
Well, to review for our viewers, I forget what year it was in the 80s, I think it was, that we no longer recognized Taiwan as a separate nation, and we have an interest group, and members of the Foreign Service who serve there have to resign their commission, and then miraculously, after they leave there, they get their commissions back.
And then they get rehired by the State Department.
Ronald Reagan referred to our China and their China in the 1980 election, so it was after that.
So the U.S. is watching this with interest. I mean, we have no interest in confronting China over Taiwan. I mean, I'm sure there are groups in the United States who still feel strongly on that issue.
I think some of the Republicans in Congress still feel very...
Well, and we got over that. But I just can't imagine that we see this as a positive sign. And hopefully it's one more step on a road of that where economic interests prevail over territorial or political interess.
I want to again take us to a different part of the world, and Fred, I want to talk to you about the UNISOR, this what is touted as an EU-like arrangement now between the 12 South American nations. And what's interesting about this is I think something we all remarked on, which is it was very difficult to find any reporting of this in the mainstream media, and so this is a story that's really under the radar. And I'm wondering if, in your view, this is a story that should be under the radar, or you're surprised that it's under the radar.
I have to say I was surprised that it was under the radar, that it hasn't got more publicity. I mean, where I cannot recollect a civil meeting where Venezuela and Colombia and all the other countries bordering Colombia and Venezuela and all of the rest of South America showed up and had a civil meeting, and they had Chavez and Uribe shaking hands, and even though Colombia chose not to join,
not to join the defense.
Not to join
committee,
that still this was a tremendous step, and I think it's part of a reaction to the United States domination traditionally in the hemisphere, and probably a little bit of a reaction to our involvement, or our perceived involvement, as helping hold up the Colombian government.
Robert, we've dominated South America, to pick up on Fred's image, for a long time. What makes this time different, if it is different, in terms of the creation of UNISOR being either a momentous achievement or, under the radar news?
I mean, there's been a growing separation from the United States, not just from Venezuela, but from the largest power, Brazil, that actually is acting as more and more as an independent power, would like a seat on the UN Security Council. And in fact, Colombia withdrawing at the last minute from the defense portion of this was a blow. I think Brazil wanted to see this as a new NATO, not just a new EU, and they had the deal cut, and it looks like the United States put great pressure on Colombia to get them to come out of it. And Colombia saw more interest in the relationship with the United States than with this new bloc. And so you really have a back and forth where most of the rest of South America was willing to go into this and be at least separate from the United States and have their own NATO, which is a fascinating development. Obviously, Colombia is the outlier right now, even though they're in UNISOR as a whole. They did not do much about trade and creating a trade bloc at this point, so it's not really an EU either. But it's significant. It's 350 million people, and it's also in South America. Then it's Brazil becoming more and more of a significant world power. In some ways, this was Brazil's attempt to create its own coalition, just like the U.S. was the dominant power in NATO after World War II.
Well, John, do you think this says more about the developing relations between the South American countries, as sort of Robert and Fred have talked about? Is it, more of an empty shell, just kind of more talking? It's a stick in the U.S. eye. I mean, how do you see that?
Well, let's walk back a couple of years. 2004, the Cusco Declaration set up a similar mechanism. Grand designs in terms of how the hemisphere was going to reorganize itself with a parliament and a judiciary in various places, and nothing came of it. There are also two competing organizations which allegedly came together to create this, one led by Brazil and one out of the Andeans. The two are so geographically separated because of those terrain issues, the Amazon Valley as well as the Andean Mountains, that the two really have they have to travel to another place. It's somewhat like traveling in Africa, where you have to go sometimes back to Europe to get to another part of Africa. So there is not great cohesion within Latin America to be able to exercise that kind of unity. But I'd say that it is much too early to be able to say whether this is an important step. It clearly is aimed at Brazil asserting its position, and Venezuela, the other party who is interested in pushing for a regional position, willing to let Brazil take the lead at this point. But whether or not that's going to continue into the future, I think that's subject to debate.
I think there's a couple of things that are also sort of underlying dynamics that will let something like this happen. First, almost every South American country, including Venezuela, is democratically elected. And there were many times in the last 20, 25 years where there were dictatorships in Uruguay, Paraguay, places like that. Now we literally have a almost transcontinental democracy. And then the second thing is the economic natural resources. Oil, which has given South America, particularly Venezuela, some power, the whole economic boom that's occurring in Brazil. I think the relationship to the world of South America is much different than it was 20, 30 years ago, and I think that contributes to the likelihood of some degree of unification.
Well, we have just over a minute left, and I want to turn back to you now and give you a bit of time to talk about any issues that you think we ought to be paying attention to in the week ahead. John, let me start with you.
Well, we've talked about this before, and it's Russia. Abkhazia is their present point of interest. I think that the Russians have backed off of the Kosovo issue because that was a little bit further away and a little bit more complicated to deal with. But I think they're sending a clear message to us and the Georgians that the Monroe Doctrine applies there too.
Robert?
Amazing dysfunction in Washington this week. You have Scott McClellan revealing that the whole Iraq war case had been trumped up, but you have the U.S. Senate recently stripping timelines for getting out of Iraq out of the House Iraq supplemental bill. So it's just a complete mess in D.C.
Fred?
The continued sort of disintegration of Belgium, which I think continues. They finally found a government after a long period of time without having any agreement, but I still think the country is sort of falling apart.
We'll leave it there. Thank you very much, John Katzka, Fred Kessler, and Robert Kraig. And to our viewers, we'll see you next week on International Focus.